Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay. Actually, I was born in New York City, but I spent the first 5 years of my life in Forest Hills.
Okay.
Then moved to Rye, and went to Archbishop Stepinac High School in White Plains.
Is that a Jebbie school?
No, it's just a regular one of those diocesan schools. Then I went to Jesuits at Holy Cross.
Holy Cross. Okay.
And 4 years of that caused me to think that my education was at an end. There was no point in going further.
When did you graduate from Holy Cross?
64.
Okay. And when did you get into journalism?
As soon as I graduated, actually, I had summer jobs on my local paper. The two.
One of the Westchester County papers?
Yeah, now part of the Gannett chain.
Right.
The old,
what was the name of it then?
It was the Portchester Daily Item. Is the name of
we
the
have
paper.
some good friends who live in Portchester.
Really?
Yeah. On Lincoln Road or Lincoln Avenue, something like that.
That's a big street in Portchester.
Right behind the Rye Town Hilton?
Yeah. Lincoln Avenue.
Lincoln Avenue, right.
Portchester, the Daily Item was a paper where Mark Harris, the novelist, worked once, and Ed Sullivan. It's most famous because Ed Sullivan used to work there as a sports writer.
Ah. Okay.
There's actually a lot of guys who've come out of there. John Vinegar, who's now the Times foreign correspondent, worked there at the same time I did.
Okay.
For a small, for a 5-person staff at any one time, there were some good people there.
So when you graduated
from Holy Cross, I went back to work there for the summer, waiting to be drafted. And then, when they hadn't gotten around to drafting me by September, I applied for a job back up in Worcester with the Worcester Telegram. And figuring, at Holy Cross, you figure after 4 years, you'd never set foot in Worcester again. But,
right.
The Worcester Telegram was a real paper. I mean, 65,000 circulation. It had a real newspaper feel to it. But
this is right around the time of the
September '64. Yeah. And then I stayed there. They never did draft me. I stayed. They took me for a physical, and in Springfield, and said that I had hypertension. That's what my caused me back to. I think what I really had was a rapid heartbeat because it was a Monday morning and it had been a long weekend. In fact, we'd been down to Fort Dix to visit a friend of ours, some friends of mine who had just been drafted. It was one of those two days without sleep things,
there you go.
Why did that out? So they gave me a 6-month deferment, and they never got back to me. But anyway, I got a job in Philadelphia as a bulletin in July of '65 as a sports writer. I was in general assignment at the Worcester Telegram. And I covered the 76ers for most of my tenure with the Bulletin.
Okay.
When Billy Cunningham was just breaking in as a player. Then in the summer of '66, I went to the Inquirer, which at that time was owned by Walter Annenberg, and it was a terrible newspaper. Really vicious right-wing smear sheet.
Yeah, right.
But they wanted me to write a column. They'd never had anybody writing a local column before, and I had. They suggested a sports column based on what I was doing for the Bulletin. And I said I was really tired of sports after a year. But what about a regular type column? And I showed them a couple of things that I said, like Breslin does, in New York. And they said, gee, that might be interesting. So they hired me to do that. And
at age 24?
Well, it would be 24, I guess. It was September of '66. So I wasn't.
So you went right to your first job with the Inquirer?
I was 23 at the time, yeah.
Your first job with the Inquirer at age 23 was to write a column?
Yeah.
And what kind of stuff did you write?
3 days a week, anything I wanted. Go out in the street, see what's happening. 1,000 words, 3 days a week. I expanded the horizons of it. From Philadelphia, I said that after a while, about a year, I said, I think I want to go to Vietnam. So they said, okay, go to Vietnam. Annenberg was very good with this thing. The managing editor was very cautious, and he said, well, I don't know. I said, well, at least, ask Mr. Annenberg. So then he would call up and say, well, Mr. Annenberg says if you want to go to Vietnam, go to Vietnam. I did for 6 weeks. The fall of '67. In fact, I got out of there just before the Tet offensive, which was good timing. A lot of people who I had spent time with were killed in that thing.
Yeah.
Down in the Delta, especially. And then, in the spring of '68, I said I wanted to go to Paris for the peace talks.
Right.
Mr. Annenberg says you can go to Paris for the peace talks as long as you fly on United States Airlines. He says, I don't believe in putting money into these foreign countries. You can't fly Air France, you can't fly BOAC, you have to fly, I flew, Pan Am or whatever, went out of Philadelphia.
Right.
So I spent a week, and that turned out to be, the peace talks were nothing for a columnist to do, because you stand around one of 500 people on the sidewalk and watch Averell Harriman's limousine go past, but it was, all those riots broke loose at that time.
Yeah.
So I wound up writing about that stuff.
Okay.
So the column was fun, and it ended. It really ended with Bobby Kennedy getting shot.
Now that's what leads into the Nixon book, right?
Yeah. I stopped. I had been down to Memphis and had written a series of columns when Martin Luther King was shot in April, and I was not in California when Kennedy was campaigning, but as soon as I heard in the middle of the night that he'd been shot, I was on a plane the next day, and I wrote a column on the plane flying out there. A real bitter, just nasty, column about what kind of a country is this type of thing, not based on reportage, which most of the columns were based on, but just based on just a reaction, an immediate reaction to it. And they ran that on the front page, and Annenberg was really offended by the fact that I had said these things about this country that he believed to be so marvelous. And he never censored the column. He didn't, even after he saw it in the first edition, he let it continue to run. But I stayed out in California then. I was actually up in the hospital on the 5th floor, when Kennedy died. I did a lot of pieces, 5 days in a row, just working around the clock with that thing. And the morning after Kennedy was buried, I finally get home and get the first decent night's sleep in a long time, and I wake up the next morning, and the first thing I see in the newspaper is the lead editorials, "We apologize." Annenberg wrote it himself. Apologizing to the readers for the poor taste shown, the poor judgment shown in printing this tasteless column that I'd written a few days ago. And, well, it's his paper, and if he lets me write what I want, I can't complain if he writes what he wants. But he was insulting. The columnist is immature and can't see the big picture, and so I just called the managing editor and I said I'm just tired. I want to take a week off. I don't want to do anything stupid. But this whole thing is, how much longer can I work for this guy? As the political thing was heating up, I could see that Annenberg was very much pro-Nixon, and the atmosphere was not going to be conducive to the kind. I didn't think this freedom that I'd had for 2 years was necessarily going to continue. Anyway, I took the week off, and during that week I had an assignment from TV Guide to do a piece about Howard Cosell, who at that point had hardly ever been written about. And in the course of spending a couple nights up at Howard Cosell's house in Pound Ridge, I meet a guy who's the executive vice president.
Pound Ridge, New York?
Yeah. Executive Vice President of Doyle Bain Burnback, and driving into the...
What's his name, guy?
The guy's name was Ed Russell. And driving into the Stamford train station from Cosell's house, there's this little carpool in this Volkswagen. Russell drives a Volkswagen because Doyle Bain Burnback handled the Volkswagen account. The world's most expensive carpool. There was like 5 guys crammed into this car, plus me way in the back. And there's not one of them making under, at that time, $150,000, $200,000 a year, I don't think.
This was driving into the Stamford station?
Yeah, where they commute from Pound Ridge.
Oh.
It's about a 10, 12-mile drive. So they have this little carpool. They take the train in from Stamford.
Well, you just happened to meet them?
I met them because I was staying overnight at Cosell's house to write the piece on Cosell.
You were going back into the city with them?
Right. And Russell says, Howard, gee, it's a good day. We just landed the Humphrey account. And I'm in the back seat, and I said,
Howard's in the car with you?
Yeah. I said, what's the Humphrey account? And Russell begins to, who's this kid? Right? He begins to explain. He says, well, we're gonna sell Humphrey the way we do Avis, Volkswagen, Heinz Ketchup. In fact, we have our Heinz Ketchup man going on the Humphrey account this week. He's the guy that invented the slogan, "Hello, Big Mouth." You know, so for preventing Hello Big Mouth for their new
They put
wide
Humphrey.
neck ketchup bottle, they gave him Humphrey, which is
Right.
you know natural transition. Back
Yeah,
to
right.
Big Mouth. But, I said, this is an amazing thing. You know, I was really astonished that a presidential candidate would be hiring an advertising agency, and I had already had a lunch scheduled with an editor from Simon & Schuster to talk about the possibility of my someday writing a book. He had in mind fiction because he had read some of my columns in Philadelphia, and he liked the dialogue, and you know, he thought, let's get together and have lunch and talk about someday doing a book. What had been, I had expected would be a very vague, you know, I'd never met a book editor before.
Yeah.
I told him, there's a great book, it seems to me, about, you know, it's called The Selling of the President, not The Making of the President, about, you know, if Humphrey's doing it, Nixon probably is too. I said, how they go about this business?
Mm-hmm.
He said, that sounds fascinating. He said, I'll tell you what.
Who's this editor now?
Gene Prokapis was his name.
P-R-O?
P-R-A-K-A-P-A-S.
And where was this discussion you had?
I forget the name of the restaurant, but
Some
it was
restaurant in Manhattan?
restaurant, yeah, some place. I met him in his office and we went out to lunch. And at the end of lunch, he said, "Listen, we'll give you $500 just to check out the possibility of to see if this is a viable thing to do."
Yeah.
Well, that's 2 weeks' pay. You know, I was making $250 a week at the Enquirer, and here's a book editor going to give me $500 to make a couple of phone calls. I don't even have to write anything. You know,
Yeah.
So I said, hell yeah. So we went upstairs and he actually drew a check right then for $500. And I said, wow, I like the book business already. You know? And I called up Mr. Russell and I was going to share with him my good fortune. And I said, gee, guess what? That business we're talking, and he says, Joe who? You know, already he'd forgotten who I was. This is this guy who was with Cosell. I said, I'm going to write a book about this whole thing. He said, the hell you are. He said, that whole conversation was off the record. He said, we don't want people to know about this. He says, you'll get no cooperation from us in any way. He says, forget you ever heard that. You know, I don't want to ever hear from you again. You know, we don't know anything about it, right? So I said, gee, they're very defensive. I said, well,
Must be honest.
Something was going on. I put a dime in a payphone. I literally was standing, Fifth or Madison Avenue someplace. I had a dime in my pocket. I put it in a payphone, and I called Nixon headquarters in New York, and I said, could I speak to the director of advertising? And they put me through a couple of people, and I get this guy named Harry Treleaven on the phone. And I said,
how do you spell his name?
Treleaven. Welsh, I think. I said to him, I'm writing a book about the role that advertising, is going to play in the upcoming election. I understand you're the director of advertising. I would like to talk to you about, ways in which I might be able to spend some time with you during the campaign, watching what you do. He said, oh, it sounds like a great idea. He said, can you come into my office at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning? So I said, sure. So I did, and I sat there and talked to him, and
this was in the middle of the summer of 68?
This is like 10 days after, 10 days after Bobby Kennedy was buried, So it's before the convention.
Right.
Okay, before either convention. And he said it's a marvelous idea. He said, you better get clearance from Len Garment just to make sure that it's okay. He said, but I think it's wonderful. And Len Garment, who I went over to see, he was in a different building. Treleaven was in an ad agency office, and Garment was at Nixon headquarters. I went over to see Garment, and he said, well, this is fine with us. He said, legitimate area, fine. He said, only one thing. He said, there might be a problem with the public, misunderstanding some of the techniques and things. As long as you promise that you're not going to write anything before the election, because you wouldn't be coming out with any of the stuff before election day. I said, oh no, I wouldn't even begin to write until after the election. He said, well then that's the only stipulation we'd have.
Well, how did you explain this? What was your phrase for this when you first talked to Treleaven? What did you say? What kind of a book did you say you wanted to write about?
A book about what the role of advertising was going to play in the upcoming campaign. I said the whole idea was new to me, that candidates employed advertising agents. See, Treleaven didn't, unlike Russell, who could perceive immediately that the public would look at this thing very cynically and say, "Oh my God." Treleaven was very proud of this. This is a perfectly legitimate area for advertising to function in. He had no sense of shame. He didn't feel there was anything to hide.
So essentially, Garment signed off on it that very first day and said, "Okay." He didn't have to ask Nixon or anybody else.
He decided it wasn't important enough to ask Nixon. I think if Teddy White or Norman Mailer or or Gay Talese or David Halberstam or somebody had come in, he might have thought longer and harder about it. But I was this kid from Philadelphia that wanted to write some book about this minor area. He had a lot of things, a lot of important things happening every day. It was a very insignificant thing, and he too thought it was an okay idea.
So what kind of agreement did you then strike with them in terms of access to the process?
I just showed up with my notebook
every day.
Every day, almost every day. I didn't quit the newspaper job until after the Republican convention. I wanted,
which was in August or something.
It was July. So I was down there sort of in a dual capacity. I was observing these guys doing their advertising stuff, but I couldn't write about any of that for the newspaper. And
so
then
you were writing columns.
I was writing columns, and then I by the end of July, I quit the newspaper thing and did this full time. And
so did they give you big enough advance?
Well, no, they didn't quite. They gave me a $10,000 advance, but it was like $5,000 now and $5,000 when you finish the book. So also, I'm paying all my expenses. The Nixon guys would think nothing, of course, of flying to California to Beverly Hills to tape, a series of commercials, and I would fly out there with them. So I'm forking out the money, to the airline. They're flying first class. I'm flying coach.
How did you manage this on a $5,000 advance?
Well, I actually had to stop in October and pull away for a week and do a piece for the Saturday Evening Post about Sonny Jurgensen, which I think I got paid $2,500 for.
Just to help you through the rest.
Yeah, and then the editor at Simon & Schuster was able to squeeze a little of that last 5 out ahead of time. Once he saw that the book was really going to be something. It was supposed. I would have liked it to have been about both of the candidates, but as I say, Humphrey's people really closed the door. If Nixon had lost that election, and of course all through the fall, Nixon's ahead by 30 points in the polls, and then the last week it starts to get very, very close, and there's this terrible dilemma I'm faced with on election night. Sort of, I had no decision to make, but I'm back in New York, staying in the Waldorf with all these Nixon people, and I'm saying, one of two things is going to happen. I'm going to wake up in the morning because it's 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and it's still not decided, and I'm either going to have no book, or else Richard Nixon is going to be president of the United States. I said, it's sort of, either way. I couldn't root for Nixon, I had learned I wouldn't have anyway, but having observed this process and how synthetic he really was, at the same time, I had no love for Humphrey because of all his cheerleading for the Vietnam War.
Right.
But Nixon won. If Nixon had lost, I think the book, would have been of minor interest to a few political scientists.
At what point did you sign a contract or get your advance or whatever from Simon & Schuster? Right after you started work, or right after Nixon people let you?
Yeah. In fact, right after I knew that they were going to let me do it, Gene Perkapis, who could have taken advantage of me, but who was an honorable man, which is perhaps one reason why he's no longer in publishing. He said, you better get yourself an agent. He said, we'll draw up a contract. He said, and we'll just screw you. He said, you better get yourself an agent. I said, I don't know any agents. He said, well, there's a lot of good ones around. He said, there's a few who are very good. And he mentioned a few names, and one of them was Sterling Lord. And about the only person I knew who had an agent who I knew well enough to call on the phone and say, could I get to meet your agent, was Jimmy Breslin. And we've come full circle now, this piece yesterday. I called Breslin and I said, I think I have this book that might work. I'm going to sign a contract. I think I need an agent. Do you think that your agent would be willing to take this on? And he said, where are you calling from? I said, again, a pay phone booth, I'm standing in a corner. He said, don't leave the booth. He said, I'll call you back in 15 minutes, right? So he calls Sterling Lord. He says, go to this address, right? He says, and one thing, he says, if he takes you on, he says, consider yourself lucky, he says, and then don't you ever call him for nothing. When he has something to tell you, he'll call you. He says, don't you ever call him, he'll call you. 15 years later, I still
don't call
very seldom call Sterling. I wait for him to call me, that's how Sterling functions. He can't get phone calls from people, at 10:30 in the morning saying, gee, chapter 4 is going kind of slow. How are things down there today? He doesn't waste time with that. So he said that he would represent me, and immediately, in fact, the first offer Simon & Schuster made was for an advance of $6,500, and he immediately got that up to $10,000.
I guess.
And so I said, gee, that's, you know, his 10% is well worth it. You know,
Yeah.
it turned out to be worth a lot more over
Yeah.
the years. But
Okay.
that's what that.
How
That's
much
what
did the book end up selling? Or
in hardcover, it ended up selling 165,000 copies. In paperback, we're having a very extended and complex discussion with pocketbooks, trying to find out how many copies it has sold over the years, because they claim most recently to have printed 1,100,000 copies, and to have shipped 1,300,000 copies, which you say, hey, there's a discrepancy.
Yeah,
How
right.
can you ship what you didn't print? And to have gotten returns of 750,000 copies. In other words, a 55% return rate, which is so far out of line for a book that's been through 13 printings over 13 years, that Sterling and I are questioning the authenticity of those figures.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons he was calling this morning. It's, paperback people are very hard. You know, they don't keep very accurate records, and they can say, gee, we shipped 500,000 copies, but 400,000 of them came back, so we only pay you for 100,000. And you have no way of proving whether they came back or didn't come back.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit about, again, this is not the main gravamen thing, but I want to talk a little bit about the effect of this book on your life. Obviously, this, you know, there was this column that was written by the guy in the Times a while ago, and it sort of, the arrival of all this money on a 26-year-old head sort of worked some things on your brain, right? Or the sudden success.
Well, there was a lot of freedom suddenly to, I mean, I had always, you know, when I got out of college, I said, gee, the best thing in the world would be to work, you know, for a good newspaper. And in 1 year, you know, I was working in Philadelphia, after, you know, 1 year out of college. Wow. Then I said, gee, the greatest thing in the world would be to write a column. You know, 1 year after that, I'm writing a column. And then I said, gee, the greatest thing in the world would be to write a magazine article. You know, and then, so I write a couple of magazine articles. I said, gee, the greatest thing in the world would be to write a book. You know, so I wrote a book. So then I said, you know, I've already done all the greatest things in the world. You know, what else do I do?
Yeah.
But I knew for sure then that I wanted to keep writing books. And having written that book, my next impulse was to write a work of fiction. And I said, I'll never have a better opportunity, because I've got you know, money coming in from this book that will sustain me, so I don't even need to sign a contract for a novel until after I finished it. And that's what I did. You know, the second book was a novel. I had the freedom to work on.
This is the Dream Team.
The Dream Team, right? Which.
But this was sort of a thinly veiled roman à clef, right?
Well, it wasn't really. That's one of the things that
Grady claims that the book was based on your own exploits of spending $450,000.
You know, this legends grow up. I can't help it.
Yeah.
I've been to Hialeah. You know,
Right.
I was at Hialeah. I said, gee, this would be a great setting for a novel. You know, I know a guy who lives in Ossining, New York, who spent many years trying to perfect the system to beat the horses. You know, I spent a week at Hialeah in the winter of 1970. I came back from there and I said, you know, in fact, I started making notes on the plane coming back. You know, this could be, you know, I'm beginning to think creatively. You know, make up a person and, you know, put him here and put him there, and, you know, it was after arguing for 6 months on all these shows. People said this stuff in The Selling of the President couldn't be true. You must have made it up. It was very ironic then to make up, you know, to write a novel and have everybody say he couldn't have made this up. This must be true.
Yeah.
And you know, that's gone on for years. McGrady is one of the probably the true believers that this thing was all, you know, the narrator was me, and that everybody was just, you know, this all happened. It didn't. You know?
You didn't have any problems with spending a lot of money on horses?
I don't think I've ever bet more than $50 on a horse in my life. I might have bet $100 once.
I'm going to talk to McGrady then. He's a great agent. He's spreading these incredible
Well,
stories.
that's wonderful. You know, I don't think that week I spent in Hialeah, I probably lost $300 or $400. You know, over the course of the week. I spent a week at Saratoga once, under contract to Knopf to write a book about Saratoga, which I had to not do because my father got sick and I had to leave early in the meeting. But I was down about $250 at that point. I think if you added up my lifetime losings at the racetrack, it would be in the vicinity of $1,000. You know, I used to sneak into Yonkers Raceway when I was a kid. I would hitchhike down and climb over the fence, you know, and we would beg money from people between races.
Yeah.
You have a quarter, you have a dime, mister? You know, get $2 together for a bet. It was fun. It was better than studying.
Yeah.
But
you're not
never.
a horse lover in any case.
I like horses. You know, I like to write about them. I've written pieces. I love the Kentucky Derby. You know, I've hitchhiked down to the Kentucky Derby. I've driven down there. I've flown down there. I went to the Derby about 10 years in a row. But to go to the track, you know, day after day.
Okay. What did you do with this guy at the Times? What was his name again? Who wrote that piece at some point? Which basically says Jesse Kornbluth talking with Joe McGinniss, and he starts purveying all this stuff. Did you give him a tough time afterwards, or what?
Yeah, I gave him a tough time. I told him he couldn't come to the publication party that he had been invited to. I thought that was a terrible piece. There was an awful lot of horseshit in that piece.
Okay.
He had a few psychodramas that he wanted to use to play out with me as a character, and I noticed that the Times hasn't used him since.
Really?
Yeah.
Was he a freelancer or regular?
Yeah, no, just a freelancer. The guy who was supposed to do that interview thing gave it to who was a regular staff person, gave it to Kornbluth instead, and he came up here and what he said he was going to do. He brought a tape recorder, and he said he was going to do a question and answer, you know, thing, which was what these author things had always been. You know, question: how did you come to write a book about Alaska? Answer, right? And we talked like this for an hour and a half. It was obvious that he had no interest at all in Alaska or in that book, and you know, he had barely read it. You know, and I said, "Jesus, this is a terrible interview." He said, "Well, that's fine. I think I got enough." I said to myself, "How can this guy have enough? You know, he doesn't even ask me any good questions."
Okay.
And he was here with a girlfriend who said, "Do you mind if she comes over?" You know, I said no, and they wound up staying for dinner, and you know, we talked, but even
I'm watching it. Oh, okay.
You know, it wasn't a question of on the record or off the record. I just think a lot of what he wrote was shit.
The psychodrama stuff. People exaggerate, you feel, the extent to which the sudden success worked bad things on your head.
Yeah, I don't think that it did. I think it probably did more good things, because it enabled me to get real serious. It enabled me to focus real clearly on what were my most important goals in life. You know, professionally, I decided what I wanted to do was to keep trying to write a better book than the one before. If I had to still work for a newspaper, I couldn't have focused that much energy on that goal. It's the littlest one is Matthew.
Matthew.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he's 4.5.
4.5?
Yeah.
Okay. But your other kids' names are the older kids?
Christine.
Christine.
Okay. It will be 17 in October.
Right.
Suzanne.
With the Z-A-N-N-E?
Z-A-N-N-E.
Right.
Who is 15.
Right.
And Joe, who will be 13 in October.
Okay.
And
they live with their mom still?
The girls do. Joe lives with us now.
Oh, he does?
Yeah.
Okay.
He came up last September. He went to school here all year.
Okay. Where does Chris still live? She lives in
Swarthmore, right outside Philadelphia.
Okay.
And Joe, Joe will be going. He's coming back, in August. He'll be going to school here again.
Now, the house. My recollection of when we were just discussing this casually was that
when Matthew was born, we were living in a rented house. And
in New Jersey.
In New Jersey. Nancy was working as managing editor of New Jersey Monthly magazine.
Okay. Whereabouts in New Jersey were you living?
We were living in the rented house was in a place called Titusville, which is about half an hour west of Princeton on the Delaware River.
You keep having all these intersections. Princeton and the Dick Cavett show.
I know.
January 1970.
I know. In fact, a bizarre intersection. I think at one time I figured out that the first time that I actually, aside from meeting Nancy at the party, the first time that I ever actually went out with her, right? So I'll meet you at 6 o'clock when we went out, was the night of Monday, February 16th, 1970.
You're kidding.
That porch is in a sad state of disrepair.
Okay.
Use your own judgment, but
Okay.
We have some carpenter ants and some.
Okay.
It's a strange
Grab
thing.
the lilac and
Yeah, great. Right.
You know, I should tell you, this is just a funny little quick aside. There's an old custom in Albany up on the shelf where where the reporters work who cover the legislature. When somebody gets a real terrific poker hand,
Yeah.
they frame it, and somebody writes a little poem, and they denote when it occurred, and so on and so forth. So they put it up on the wall. There's 3 or 4 of those on the wall, right there on the shelf, and there's one of them from about 2:00 in the morning, February 17th, 1907.
Really?
Yeah.
Whose hand? I don't know.
I don't remember. I think it was Victor Ostrowitsky or Arvis Chalmers or one of those characters. But I just
Yeah.
happened to notice that one time standing around.
I
here.
know.
But that was the first night you ever went out with Nancy.
What
Yep.
was the significance of that date?
That's the day. That's the night of the evening before the murders.
Oh,
It's the night that they happened. I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, they happened
they
at
happened at 3 o'clock
Yeah.
Tuesday morning, but
Right.
it was that night. You know?
Yeah. Where did you go out that night?
We went down to a place called the Lion's Head in the village, a bar, restaurant.
Mhm.
I
You think you were probably
I
there at
forget why. You know, we went there, I don't know, but I don't think we were still there at that time.
Yeah.
It just seemed like it was an odd thing, like the last night that Jeffrey ever spent with Colette, you know, it was really the first night that I
Yeah.
ever saw Nancy.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Moving here, okay, so we're in this rented house. I had to sell the last house. We were living in a little teeny-weeny house in Stockton, New Jersey, just up the Delaware River. And I had to sell that to get money to finish going to Extremes, because I ran out of money and I wasn't finished yet. And I sold the house, you know, and moved into this rented house. I said, gee, when the book is published, then I'll have enough money. I'll sign a new contract and I'll buy another house. Well, we lived in this rented house for almost 2 years, I guess. And I finished writing it on June 1st, 1979, which I remember very specifically because I put the manuscript, I wrote the last, not chronologically in the book, the last 5 pages, but the last 5 pages that I wrote that morning, and I wrapped the whole thing up and put it in the mail on the way to Newark Airport to fly to California, where Sterling had arranged for me to do this 8-week stint as writer-in-residence at the Herald-Examiner. This is a thing that Jim Bellows,
Right.
who was the editor there then, had started. And Bellows had started this concept when he was at the Washington Star, bringing in a guy who's not normally a newspaper columnist and have him just write a column for 8 weeks.
Okay.
And,
But this was a Sterling initiative. Sterling
Yes.
Road initiative.
Yeah, I remember Sterling had come out to our house in New Jersey around Christmas time of 78, and he said, you know, it's time to start thinking about what you're going to be doing next. And I said, this book has really been a long, drawn-out, exhausting book, and he said, I have a good idea, and maybe it's time to finally do that thing that Jim Bellows has been after you about. He had been wanting me to do it when he was in Washington, and I had said, well, when I finished my book. Well, it took me so long to finish the book, he wasn't in Washington anymore, but he still wanted me to do it. So Sterling arranged that. I would go out there for 8 weeks. I would do 3 pieces a week. We rented a house out there. We rented our house in New Jersey. We rented our rented house. We sublet the rented house.
Okay. This was your first time back doing newspaper work since you had left the Philadelphia Inquirer back in '68.
Except for a very occasional, like a piece for the Times op-ed page, or, on a sustained basis. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what led to Jeffrey, because I got out there and had to start working immediately and produce 3 pieces a week based in a town where I was totally unfamiliar with anybody or anything.
Right.
Los Angeles is not the kind of town like New York or Washington or even Philadelphia where you can just sort of move around in the streets and meet people, and everything is very subterranean and mysterious. And, it's so spread out. We were living in this house way out in the San Fernando Valley where it's 105 degrees and filled with smog every day. And people have high locked fences around their little yards, and there was a gas crisis. You couldn't get any gasoline for your cars, and Bellows would send a copy boy out to pick up my column and bring it in. It was a guy on a motor scooter. So I was completely isolated, and I needed to have 3 ideas a week.
Yeah.
And I'd only had one idea for 4 years, which was Alaska, and I had been so immersed in that. So I was frantically looking. I'd go out and buy the papers every morning, hoping I'd find some idea, something I could write about. And I guess it was very early, like the beginning of the second week, maybe. I pick up I forget if it was in the Times or the Herald Examiner, but there was a story that the Long Beach Police Officers Association was going to have this disco dinner fundraiser for Jeffrey. And I said, Jesus, is that case still going on? I said,
Well, you had heard of this case before.
I heard of the case. I can remember, in fact, I remember seeing that story in the Daily News, like the day after it happened, because I was in New York,
Right.
Green Beret's family found slain or whatever.
But you hadn't really followed it to any extent.
No, but one thing had happened that's interesting, or maybe it isn't interesting, but it was I hadn't followed it. I remember reading some weeks later that they had charged, I remember the story sounded weird to begin with, but boy, it's a weird story. Then they charged the guy, and then I don't even think I knew that they had dropped the charges, because I was working on this novel. And we were living in Blairstown, New Jersey at that time. Even further up the Delaware River, near the water gap. And Nancy had gone to New Rochelle High School and was in the same class as a woman named Liz Friedman.
Mm-hmm.
Liz Friedman, who is now a lawyer in San Diego, had gone on to law school, I think, at the University of Pennsylvania, where she had as a professor Bernard Siegel.
Ah.
And she was basically the Sarah Simmons of 1970. She worked as the legal assistant during the Article 32 hearing.
I see.
And it was sometime that winter, like when Jeff would have been back in New York, and maybe January, February, as we now know, he had been trying frantically, and Bernie had been trying frantically, to find somebody to write a book.
Right.
Bernie perhaps because he figured this is how he was going to get paid.
Right.
Jeff because he wants to become famous, right? Among other reasons, right? Also because he wants to become rich. So. Having been turned down by John Sack and Robert Sherrill and all these other people that we now know, he was approaching.
Let me just hang on for a second. We'll flip this over. Let me just rewind it for a second and see if it's working.
Session. A pretty sloppy job of tape recording. He had lost his microphone stand, and the tape was very unclear in places. And,
All right. So you were talking about Liz Friedman.
Yes. So Liz Friedman, in January, February of what would be 1971, calls up Nancy, because she knows that Nancy and I are now living together, and asks Nancy if I might be interested in writing a book about this courageous Green Beret who was so falsely accused and had been through this terrible ordeal.
Mm.
And the reason that she thought of calling Nancy to ask about me was because one of the reasons, at least, was because in 1967 or 68, when I was still writing the column in Philadelphia, I had met Bernie Siegel. I had written a column about a client of his.
Okay.
In fact, it was a client who had been accused of triple homicide. A kid from Penn who had gotten drunk one night and set fire to a papier-mâché snowman in a fraternity house, and the 3 guys died in the fire. The kid is accused of triple homicide. Siegel represents him. The kid winds up convicted of manslaughter. His officer is some time in prison. But I wrote a very, I think it was a kind of a sympathetic column about the kid, something that appealed to Siegel anyway.
Okay.
And he remembered me from that. And in the interim, of course, there had been the selling of the president, so I was a bigger name in terms of writing a book then.
Right.
So I never even talked to Liz Friedman myself, but Nancy said, well, I don't know, he's very busy with a novel now. In fact, we were about to go to Vietnam.
You were writing the Dream Team at the time.
At the time. And I just signed a deal with a newspaper syndicate that Sterling had sort of set up, the night papers being the heart of it, but others being involved, to go back to Vietnam. A trip on which Nancy accompanied me as photographer. She was, in fact, Newsday ran all the stuff. They ran 2 whole consecutive Sunday magazines, or I guess at that time
It was
it was a Saturday magazine.
Oh, that was
right?
when McGrady was the editor of the Saturday magazine. I
Yeah,
guess.
they ran one of Nancy's pictures was on the cover.
Mhm.
One of those, and they ran 2 consecutive things were devoted just to stuff I did from Vietnam. Anyway, I was getting ready to go back to Vietnam, working on the novel, and didn't really have much interest in this. But Nancy said, send them. Liz Friedman said, well, we have a whole bunch of stuff that's so fascinating, that once he sees this, nobody could resist. I may not be quoting her accurately because I didn't talk to her, but that's the sense that Nancy got of the conversation. And in any event, they never sent anything. There was no follow-up.
Okay, so that never got any posted.
So then I forgot about it entirely until I see this thing in the California newspaper. I said, God, that case is still going on. This is definitely worth, one of my 800-word pieces for Jim Bellows.
So then you tried to get a hold of Siegel?
I tried to get a hold of MacDonald. I said, it would be worth 800 words to write about a guy who, 9.5 years later, is being called back, to stand trial for these murders. I mean, that's the thing that first appealed to me, as being the most curious and fascinating aspect of it is I'd never heard of a case where almost 10 years had passed and the guy had established his whole life and everything, and now, after all this time, he's going to have to go back and stand trial for these things. I said, definitely worth talking to this guy. But I said, geez, the guy's probably, going to be completely unwilling to talk. Who would want to talk about it? So I called up expecting that I was going to get this big hassle.
You called his office?
I called his office. I called St. Mary's Hospital. And a woman who I now know to be Barbara Gallagher answered the phone. She said, Dr. MacDonald is lecturing in San Francisco today. And I explained who I was and what I wanted. And she said, I'll have him, I'll give him the message. And I said, well, that's that. I'll probably never hear from the guy. I'll call again tomorrow. 8 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings.
At your home?
At my home. It's Jeff.
This is the following morning.
Next morning, right? He says, tells me how much he likes the Herald Examiner sports section, and we had this conversation. I said, it was probably very painful, and I'm being very, I had no idea how eager he was to see me at this time.
So you're trying to be delicate.
Very delicate, and he was very cordial and said, oh, no, come on down. I think it was a Thursday or Friday that we talked
Same
on the
week?
phone. And he said, it must have been Friday, I think, because he said, come on down for breakfast, tomorrow morning. We'll drive down, we'll go out and get something to eat, and we'll talk. Okay,
so that's the scene you started the book with, your first meeting with him.
Right.
Now, by this time, you still haven't seen Siegel yet.
I haven't seen Siegel.
You're directly dealing with Jeffrey.
With Jeffrey. But when I haven't seen Siegel, I hadn't given the conscious thought to the name Bernie Siegel in, since 1971.
And you weren't aware at this moment that he was Jeffrey's lawyer?
No, not until I walked in to the apartment, and about the first thing that Jeff says is, Bernie Siegel said to say hello. And I said, who? And I really didn't. Bernie Siegel. My lawyer, Bernie Siegel. I said, oh. And there's still nothing coming. I mean, it wasn't like I knew Bernie Siegel very well in Philadelphia. I had written this one column out of maybe 300 columns about one client that he had represented. That was the extent of it. He said, you wrote a column. He says, then he made kind of a joke, which in retrospect, even at the time, it struck me as an odd joke. But in retrospect, even odder. He said, yeah, Bernie says you're an expert in triple homicides. And he kind of laughed. I said, oh. Okay. He said, Bernie represented that kid from Penn. I said, oh, okay, now it's coming back to me. Yeah, okay. Oh, well, that's nice, Tell Bernie I said hello. This time I'm not thinking of anything beyond getting 800 words, So we went out, we had our brunch, and we came back, and he said that I over the brunch, was not asking him to tell me what happened on the night of February 17th, but at some point I said, I got to bring this up. So we're back in his apartment, and I bring it up, and he says, oh, it's very painful to talk about. I can't possibly relive it, I can't go through it again, but here's a packet of material that explains the whole thing. He says, in fact, this is very coincidental, you're coming down here, because the trial's about to begin, and for years we've been looking for somebody to write a book who would tell the truth, who would tell the whole story, and he asked me if I would be interested in writing a
He
book.
broached the subject to
He
you.
broached the subject to me about a book. And I said, well, I don't know, I don't know what book I'm going to do next. One of the reasons I'm out here is to spend, 8 weeks not writing a book and see what develops. I said, I'll take, be happy to take the stuff. And I did. And I drove back up the freeway thinking, interesting guy. I had no idea whether he was innocent, guilty. I didn't know any facts. All I knew was the guy was going to go off and
You didn't have any
stand trial.
strong impression about guilt or innocence?
No,
at that
I
stage?
just said, I said, gee, he strikes me as being a little bit cold, or there's a certain, despite the cordiality, and the gregariousness, there struck me as being something a little bit icy, about him. I felt, but I said to myself, gee, for 10 years, every time anybody meets this guy, he knows that the first question they're asking themselves is, did he kill his wife and kids or didn't he?
Yeah.
And that could make you act, certainly could make you act icy, or give you some kind of reserve. So I didn't have any strong impressions.
But you wrote the column which appeared
I wrote
a couple
the
of
column,
days
which
later?
appeared a couple of days later, and
What happened
he
next
was
with the
annoyed.
book?
He was annoyed about the column because I emphasized too much the fact that he had a yacht and he had a sports car. He
Right.
didn't like the fact that, well, the column ran. These columns were running in other cities too, as well
Right.
as Los Angeles. At least they were syndicated and they were available to other cities. This one ran in a lot of places. What happened next was I started to read through the stuff that he gave me, and the more I read, the more I said, "Geez, this really is an interesting case."
What
And
kind of stuff did he give you?
He
Just
gave me
newspaper clippings and like
the
that?
Rock Report, newspaper clippings, the Newsday stuff, the interview with him from 1970, that Cummings did. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and it was a very carefully prepared packet of material, and it was obvious that I wasn't the only person that he was handing these things out to.
I see.
But I said, it might be interesting. I said, especially, I think I called him in, and I said, this is interesting. I might want to do this. I said, but there would be a couple of conditions that we'd have to have established up front. I said, the thing that would interest me most, I said, would be, I wouldn't want to just go to North Carolina and sit there, like the newspaper people are going to have to do. I would want to actually live with you during the trial. I've never seen a book done from, by a professional writer, as opposed to the lawyer himself or the
Right.
defendant himself, from inside the defense in a major criminal trial. I said, this would be a very interesting point of view. I'd never even attended a murder trial. I've been to traffic court, maybe for a parking ticket, that I was disputing in Princeton. I knew nothing, but I'd never covered the courts or anything. I thought that would be very, maybe an interesting book, an inside view of the defense type of thing. And I said, I don't know if your lawyer would agree to that. He said, well, I think, he probably would, Siegel. I said, that would be one thing, and then, of course, I'm sure that there would have to be some kind of paper signed, releases. No publisher would go into this thing without releases from you waiving all rights to sue in case you didn't like the way it came out. He said, oh, no problem with that, no problem with that, He said, there is one thing. He says, I got a lot of very high legal fees. He said, my expenses, I think he used a figure like they were over $500,000 that he had spent over the years. He said, so one of the things that I'd be interested in, he said, would be some way of sharing the proceeds of this. If I gave you all this exclusive access and all these immunities or all these waivers of rights to sue, I said, well, that's something that's why I have an agent, and that's probably one of the reasons why you have a lawyer. I said, let's let them talk about that.
So then
I called Sterling, and I said to Sterling, I really think I'd like to do this. Half the reason was because I was now in my third week of doing this thing for Bellows, and I was hating it. It was terrible. Every column was like pulling a tooth out of my mouth.
Yeah, right.
I mean, Bellows thought they were okay, but Jesus, I was, I had been away from that business too long, and I just didn't like L.A. I didn't like the whole thing. It was a great chance to get out early. Plus, half the reason I'm out there is to find a new book. Here's a new book. And I said to myself, naively, oh so naively, unlike Alaska, where all I thought of in the beginning was going to Alaska, and once I get there, I'll figure out what the book should be. I said, here's a ready-made story with a beginning and a middle and an end. All I got to do is go to North Carolina for the trial, then do a little, digging around the edges afterwards, and I can do this book in a year and a half, at the outside. Sterling, I said, the guy wants some money, somewhere along the line for this, for his legal expenses. And Sterling said, how do you feel about that? And I said, well, I don't like it on two levels. I don't like it because I'm doing the work, and I don't like anybody else getting paid for work that I do. He's a doctor. He gets paid for being a doctor. I'm a writer. I get paid for being a writer. Why should he get paid for my writing? Secondly, I said, suppose the guy did it. I said, I feel, even worse thinking that some guy who killed his wife and kids is making money, off of my work. That disturbed me a lot from the beginning. I said, see what you can do talking to Siegel. So Sterling talks to Bernie, and
by this time you haven't even spoken to Siegel yet yourself.
No. Sterling talked, and then Sterling calls me back. He said, well, at the same time, Sterling has to talk to publishers and try to get a publisher interested enough to make it, I needed an advance big enough to live on for 2 years. The exact sequence, it's hard even to remember because there were so many phone calls from different time zones, but basically it all came together that Delacourt Dell, in the person of Ross Claiborne, who was
Claiborn?
N-E.
N-E? Okay.
Yeah. He was the editor-in-chief. He was interested, and he would, for a combined advance, he would come up with a total advance of, I think it was $250,000 for hardcover plus paperback rights.
Okay. At
the same time, I was saying to myself, I got to get, I need at least $75,000 a year to live on, to work, pay my expenses for doing a book, to pay my mortgage and my child support and my, the airplane tickets for my kids. I can't really function on less than that. So I said, I got to have 150, myself in order to make this work for me.
Assuming a 2-year book, a 2-year span.
Assuming a 2-year book,
Right.
Another naive assumption, right?
Right.
So I said to Sterling, I was at that time already quite a bit in debt from even after selling the house, I said, I need more of the money up front. So Sterling worked out a thing with Siegel where there was going to be a sliding scale where I would get 80% of everything up to 150, and then 2/3 of everything beyond that. So MacDonald would get 20% of everything up to 150, and 1/3 of everything beyond that. And I said, well, if that's what they're going to insist on. And I never talked to Jeff about this directly. I never even talked to Siegel about this directly.
But you had to, in other words, you had to accede on the principle of letting them get some money because they weren't going to do it.
Otherwise, they said they weren't going to do it, and there would be no way for me. They would at the same time. It turns out to be true. Siegel was using as a bargaining chip, and it did turn out to be true. The fact that they were talking to Joe Wambaugh about doing this book.
Right.
In fact, the afternoon of the morning that I spent with MacDonald, MacDonald told me he had to go work in the hospital. Well, maybe he did eventually, but that afternoon, he had the same kind of meeting he had with me with Wambaugh. But he had first approached Wambaugh, as you know now, by mail in 1975. Now he meets Wambaugh in June of '79, and Wambaugh's very interested. He said, I don't think I can go to North Carolina for the trial. If there's some way for you to give me videotapes of the trial, he said, I would, like to write this book. Now, Wambaugh was published by Ross Claiborne, had been publishing Wambaugh. The whole thing was very complex.
Yeah.
Claiborne said, Joe Wambaugh, they're talking to Joe Wambaugh also, and he's interested. And Siegel is telling Wambaugh that he thinks he can get Judge Dupree, think of this in retrospect, to agree to let him videotape the trial, so he can send Wambaugh the videotapes.
And they would make it into a movie called Fat Chance.
Yes. Yeah. So I said, all right, I'm not thrilled about the sharing the income, business, but I said to Sterling and to myself, the least I should do, the least I really ought to do at this point is do what a juror would be instructed to do, and that is to presume innocence.
Yeah.
If the guy is innocent, I don't have any moral qualms about him making any money. I just
professional qualms.
I just resent the fact that I'm not going to get all the money for doing all the work.
Right.
But on the other hand, without this, there's no book.
Yeah. Right.
And I set out in L.A. for another month and I read about this trial going on and say, gee, I should have written that book.
Right. Well, I should have flown.
Had to make a decision. In fact, I didn't get the contract signed until the trial was half over.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was down there the first 3 or 4 weeks, still negotiating. Sterling's negotiating with Dell about. There was a couple of other publishers were all. Viking was interested, and there was some division of Simon & Schuster was interested. So, in the end, it wound up being Dell. I remember there was a big conference call one morning during a recess. You know, a 10-minute recess in the court. I had to go out to a payphone or one of those phones outside, and there was when you weren't calling in your story, and there was a free phone. There was this conference call set up with people from Dell. They had like 5 people on the other end of the line asking me questions about the whole thing.
And this was like halfway through the trial, you said?
It might not have been half. It might have been 2 or 3 weeks into the trial, though.
Now, had you signed an agreement of any kind with Siegel first before you got to the point of signing the contract with Delacorte Dell?
No. It all came. Sterling. I remember Sterling sent down an agreement that MacDonald. Dell's lawyers drew up an agreement that MacDonald had to sign.
Right.
There was a separate agreement that was signed, that I signed, MacDonald signed, I don't know if Siegel signed it or not, about the financial thing.
Right.
Then the separate agreement, about the thing the lawyers drew up was about the waiver of,
right.
He couldn't sue for libel, he couldn't sue for invasion of privacy, even if the jury, it was a very strictly worded thing, even if the jury were to find him innocent, and I were to write a book suggesting that he was guilty, he
couldn't sue you
forego
for
his right to sue for anything.
Okay. And he would have no editorial control.
That was another thing. I mean, that was a crucial thing. That was in the agreement also, that he would have no editorial control. He would not even have the right to see the manuscript or to see the book in any form prior to his publication.
Okay.
Which was something that he was...
He wasn't too happy about.
Well, in the beginning, no problem at all. He was very, he signed without a whimper. Without...
Okay.
No, there was never any negotiating on any of that stuff.
Okay.
The only negotiating that ever took place was between Siegel and Sterling about the money thing, where Siegel was trying to get more money,
But you ended up with this 20%,
33%.
33, and
right.
The ultimate, Breslin said it was a 280 advance. It was actually 250 or
well,
something?
originally it was 250, and then as the book takes longer,
right,
and as I begin to get access to, to areas that I wasn't at that time thinking I was going to get access to.
Right.
Such as Freddie and Mildred.
Right.
I'm learning more. It's becoming a bigger book.
Right.
It's taking longer to write. Sterling goes to Dell and says, this is not really the same book that we had contracted for. It's now a much bigger book, ultimately going to be a better, more successful book. But in the meantime, it's costing Joe much more money in terms of expenses because I'm flying all over the place, seeing different people.
Right.
And it's taking longer. It's going to take longer to write. So Ross Claiborne, who was still there, agreed to an increase of the advance from 250 to 300.
Right.
With some stipulation that I had to turn in 100 pages a month or something.
Okay.
And they would then send out a check after they'd gotten the pages in the mail.
Right.
Some silly agreement like that. You can't write a book that way. But
okay.
Soon thereafter, Ross Claiborne leaves Dell, and they had gotten to the point of having made...
He was at Dell or Delacorte, or some...
He was in charge of both.
Okay.
Delacorte is the hardcover division, Dell is the paperback division.
Right.
All of which is owned by Doubleday.
That's the part I didn't know about.
When you were going to Doubleday.
When I was going to Doubleday,
right. Yeah.
So you finally got home.
They give me 3 of these, $10,000, additional payments, and then Ross Claiborne is gone, and then Morgan Entrikin is an editor who figured briefly in this, and then he went to Simon & Schuster. So last May, we're at the point where I'm still a few months away from finishing the book.
And you want your last 20 grand?
I need it. I've borrowed everything I can from banks.
Right.
Again, the maximum. And Dell says, forget it. Nope. Nothing. In fact, if he won't deliver the manuscript right now, it's already overdue. We're going to demand our full advance back plus 18% interest.
This is May of 82.
Of 82. So
right.
There then ensued just the 8 worst weeks of my life, I think, where I'm borrowing money from individuals, from friends, week by week, to live on. And Sterling is saying it's going to be impossible. These people simply won't do business. They don't really seem to want the book. He said, I think I better show it to somebody who might want it. So he eventually shows it to Phyllis Grand at Putnam's, who says right away, of course I want it, but how can I get it? And Dell says, well, anybody who wants it can get it by paying, they began with some really usurious, and this is not your friend O'Reilly, by the way. He was not one of the imbeciles in business suits.
And O'Reilly's not even my friend. I just met him at a softball game.
But he was one of the few decent people. When Sterling finally got to O'Reilly, he was able to work out the final deal, which is still a nasty deal.
How did that work out?
That they would have to get an immediate repayment of $150,000. That 1 year later, in other words, this coming July, that they would get payment of the next $130,000. But that $130,000 would grow an annual interest rate of 10% from July of '82. So the $130,000 is now $143,000.
I see.
That I owe them, which of course I can't pay them.
Right.
And to put some teeth into it, so they didn't just have to come after me and try to get money from me if I don't have the money, they wrote into the agreement that they would have a lien, not a court-ordered lien, but it has that effect.
Right.
A 100% flow-through of any money that comes from Fatal Vision, rights controlled by the new publisher. That would be book club money and paperback money. And 75% of any money that would come from rights controlled by me, which would be first serial, foreign sales, movie.
Right.
75% of all that would go directly to them, not to me, and 100% of all the money,
until such time as their money was paid off.
It's paid off.
How did you get any extra money at this time when the book switched publishers so that you could continue to work?
Yeah.
So that was Putnam giving you some money?
What Putnam's did was they signed me to a 2-book contract. And they said, we will pay you now the first 25% of the advance for your next book so you can finish writing the first book.
I got you.
And that's what enabled me to finish writing the first book.
Okay.
And now I have to get them to pay me more money for the next book, but before they'll do that, they'd like to know what it is, which is a legitimate...
and you haven't come up with that?
Well, I actually have a notion that I'm trying to develop and work on, which I don't want to talk about yet. But
I understand.
I haven't really had the opportunity to because, up until a month ago, I was still working on this. I was revising the galleys and...
But in other words, to get down to the nub of it, even though you have this nice house and the book is going to be a bestseller and it's going to be your main selection of the Book of the Month Club and all this other stuff, you still owe all this money back to Delacorte.
I owe them $143,000.
Yeah.
And the other thing is this, MacDonald was getting his cut all along.
Yeah. How much has he gotten altogether, do you think, by now?
Something, I would think it's in the vicinity of $70,000.
Okay.
But now when I'm repaying Dell, he's not repaying 1/3, 20%. He's not repaying anything.
You're just repaying.
So I'm repaying.
And his agreement also gives him rights to money from the royalties, like once you get above the advance amount.
Yeah.
So he would still get that 33%.
Yeah, but now it gets very complicated because it wouldn't be until after Dell was fully repaid, so we have to start recalculating the whole thing.
Okay, but he's still, once Dell is fully repaid, he's going to still get some money out of the deal.
Once they're fully repaid, plus $73,000 more, because I have repaid them, I will have repaid them $73,000 that he got.
Yeah, right.
And he didn't repay them.
I see.
Okay. It's very complicated.
But that was written into the Putnam's deal, that $73,000 and so on and so forth.
Putnam's didn't care anything about MacDonald. All they cared about is we'll pay this much money, and Sterling has to agree that Doubleday gets it all up front. I was allowed to keep the last installment of the finishing money from Fatal Vision, but any money beyond that, they put this lien on until the 143, which I don't get royalties now until next May. So the book goes on sale in September.
Yeah.
The royalty period is from July to January.
Right.
But they don't send out checks until 120 days after the royalty period ends.
Okay.
So that's not till next May.
So you can't even pay Doubleday back until next May.
For the next 11 months. By then, the 143, if they keep 10% interest, will be 157.
Yeah. So you're still living off your teaching and whatever you got as a partial advance towards the second book.
That's right. That's right.
And Jeffrey's got 70 Ks or thereabouts, or had 70 Ks.
You know, which he used to buy what? He traded in his Citroen Maserati for a Jaguar. He bought himself a second condominium at the mountain. And of course, he's got this. You know, he's been telling people that it's the book proceeds that have been financing this whole investigation and the whole new legal thing, but.
He hasn't gotten any proceeds in a while.
Months and months and months. It might be a year since he's gotten, a penny out of the book.
But well, in any case, if nothing happens to intervene, like let's say, a federal statute, Jeffrey MacDonald ultimately will get some more money out of this book and everything that surrounds it.
It all depends how it does.
Yeah, but we're assuming it's going to do well. So if it does well and you manage to pay off Dell and anything like that, he still stands to get some more money.
That agreement remains in effect. That agreement, the agreement didn't say. This agreement is only good if you're found not guilty.
Right.
So there is that.
Okay, so he would profit even from a movie and all that kind of stuff.
In theory,
okay.
If under federal law the way it now is.
Okay. Did the agreement stipulate the amount of access that you would be getting in return for the money that you were giving him, or what how much they'd allow you to listen to, what kind of access you'd get?
I said something like complete.
Okay.
And they lived up to every bit of that. I mean, there was never a closed door. There was never.
Okay.
The only report that Bernie didn't want me to see was that psychiatrist report, which I saw anyway.
Ultimately, anyway.
I might be jumping ahead here, but when I was back living in his apartment after he was convicted,
right?
To go back to the book came about. I'm going through. He had a whole file folder marked book,
right?
Which goes back to the original letters to John Sack and all these people,
right?
There was an announcement in the Herald Examiner that I was going to start doing this writer-in-residence thing with a little picture of me that ran on the top of page 1.
Right.
And he had torn that out with a little notation, book, next to it,
Book question mark?
Yeah. So,
Jesus.
There I see that he was thinking of me before I even knew about him.
That's kind of scary.
When I got to California.
That's kind of scary. Were there any other projects that you had going at the time you began the book that you, other than, well, you had to stop the writer-in-residence thing, right? You didn't complete the 8 weeks.
No, I did 4 weeks.
Okay, but that's the only project you had going that you stopped.
Yeah.
Okay. Delacorte, we talked about that, Size of the Advance. Well, we who were covering the trial had some notion that there was a magazine possibility going on, that there might be, you might write some periodic reports from the trial and syndicate it out to newspapers or magazines, or New York Magazine or something like that.
There were a couple things that were under discussion, and I just decided not to do them.
Okay.
The deeper into it I got, the more I said, I don't want to write anything about this too soon, because it's a lot more complicated.
Right. So by the time you got to the trial, everything else except the book had already been gone out the window.
Well, there was still...
Hello, Matthew.
Hi, Matthew.
I have some flowers to show you.
Can I see? Can you say hi to Kenny?
That's Kenny. And I'm Bob. Hello, Matthew.
Hi to Bob, who you might remember from... Oh, let me see these flowers.
Oh, they're gorgeous.
We get this stuff.
Okay. Wow. You made those this morning, huh? They're beautiful.
Oh,
They're
was
really
something
beautiful.
pressed into the paint to do that? Or is that
Yeah.
just
How
the
did you
brush?
make those?
Paint.
With a brush?
No, it's paint.
And did you how'd you put the paint on the cardboard?
With a sponge.
Oh, with a sponge.
Yeah.
Oh. They're beautiful. Can I keep them out here for a few minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Bob and I are talking for a few minutes now.
It's going to be a little while.
Yeah. Where were we?
Oh, okay. We just said that you had just dropped the magazine idea.
I hadn't. There was a possibility. Bellows was interested in me doing something from the trial, maybe for him.
Right.
Sterling had talked to a couple of magazines. New York Magazine, in particular, was interested in me doing an article at the conclusion of the trial, about the trial. But by the time the trial was over, in fact, I remember I called the editor, and that was a possibility.
Okay.
Throughout the trial, and it was just the day after the verdict, I called the editor at New York Magazine and told her that I just wasn't going to do it.
All right, let's go to the trial then. What were the living arrangements at Kappa Alpha?
They were primitive.
Well, you were all on the second floor or something like that? All the bedrooms up on the second floor?
Some were on the first floor, some were on the second floor.
Who was staying
Terry
there?
was on the first floor. Fran Fine, that secretary, was on the first floor. Different people who would come and go, like the California crowd, was usually on the first floor.
Right.
the second floor, there was Jeff, and next to him there was Mike Malley,
Right.
and then I don't know if there's anybody else on that side. They might have had that whole wing.
Mm-hmm.
Then, I was in a corner room on the back side.
Oh, so you weren't real close to where Jeff's room was?
No, in
Okay.
fact, we were separated by the bathroom, which didn't even have stalls on the doors.
Okay.
And there was a bathroom.
These are individual dorm rooms, or they were rooms for a couple of
There
people?
were rooms for a couple of people.
Okay, but they were just
probably-
like bunk bed type
yeah,
things?
bunk bed type things.
Okay. All right.
There was, Bernie was in one room. Sarah.
Also on the second floor?
Yeah, Wendy Router.
Okay, so most of the actual big defense team was up on the second floor then?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you guys eat most of your meals together? You and Jeff and all the
Yep.
others?
Most breakfasts, every breakfast. I think.
And downstairs?
Downstairs in the
Cafeteria, whatever?
It was a dining room for the fraternity people, and they kept the cook on from the fraternity house
Okay.
for the summer, or at least for that portion. Remember, they didn't stay at the fraternity house the whole trial. It was only for the first 6 weeks, and then moved into this downtown or motel.
Okay,
at
right.
the end.
Right. Did they get this fraternity house free of charge, or do they have to
No,
pay?
they paid something for it, but it was a lot cheaper than motel would have been.
Yeah.
I believe Wade arranged this.
Okay.
He would have been the logical person to.
Okay.
And besides saving a lot of money, the big factor that they emphasized was that there was a lot more privacy.
Yeah,
and in
right.
fact, there was, because there were these big living rooms, and they could sit there and they could take out pictures, and they could just work,
Yeah.
without being hassled by anybody.
So did you eat, like, lunch you guys usually ate at the courthouse?
Yeah.
Just
One of those
round
Kappa
bag?
Alpha brothers would bring in, a bunch of sandwiches.
Okay. And then
And then
supper meal?
supper would be back, during the week, back at the fraternity house. Occasionally we'd go out to a restaurant, more often on weekends.
Okay. Did you stay there the whole time, or did you go back and forth on weekends a little bit to?
It was only one weekend. I
Still in
think it was
Jersey,
the
but-
weekend that I flew up with you on the same plane. I think that was the only weekend. See, when Nancy.
I thought that was at the end of the trial, though.
No, I think it was before that. In fact, I sure it was before that, because I didn't leave right after the trial. Nancy had stayed in California. We had sublet this house. Nancy couldn't even come home.
Oh,
when
I
I went
see,
to
yeah.
North Carolina, she was stuck
I see.
in this horrible
So
rented
she
house
stayed in California.
for another month. And I hadn't seen Matthew, who at that time was only 6 months old, for 6 weeks. So there was that one weekend that I flew up. It was a busy weekend. It was a weekend that Helena Stokely, got punched in the nose at the
Right.
hotel and everything.
Right,
That was the
right.
only weekend that I wasn't there.
Ah.
Every other weekend I was there.
Okay. Too bad you missed that one. That would have been. Well, you found out about it.
I wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have been with Helena Stokely
Yeah.
anyway.
Okay. Did you have to pay for any of this lodging, by the way, or this was just part of the deal? You personally, I mean.
I personally did not pay. At the Kappa Alpha house, I didn't pay for any of the lodging.
Okay.
Once we moved to the motel, I paid for my own room in the motel.
Okay. Did you and Jeff run together every day or frequently?
Occasionally. He would run every day. He would run 5 miles every day.
And the track right there,
Yeah, the track
near
on
the
the campus.
On the
Yeah,
campus,
right. I would go down there. I had a running injury. I really screwed up a knee.
Right.
And I had two things wrong with me, which are not, of interest to anybody except a podiatrist. But in fact, I was in California. I was getting these treatments from this running doctor up there.
Right.
And I was in real bad shape, just trying to get back into it. So I would just go down and jog a little bit. I did wind up doing the New York Marathon that year anyway, but I certainly in August wasn't, thinking of it or training for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, we would often go down to the track, and he would run 5 miles at like 7-minute miles. Really busting his ass. 98
Yeah.
degrees, and then he would come back and lift weights.
So he was in terrific shape.
Yeah, he was in good shape.
Yeah. Okay. So there were no meetings that they didn't let you attend. They let you in on every meeting. Right?
Every meeting.
And you pretty
Every
much stuck with Jeff's body. Wherever Jeff went, you tried to go.
Except, like in the evenings, he would often retire to his room and look over the grand jury testimony of whoever was scheduled to testify
Right.
the next day.
And you would just then.
I would sit around, listen to what Bernie was talking to the people, the
Yeah.
assistants about her.
Okay.
When expert witnesses would be in to testify, I would just sort of, BS with them.
Okay. How did you?
There was the two most crucial things I think were like even other members of the defense were not allowed in. I was, which was the screening of the videotape hypnosis for the psychiatrist from Chapel Hill.
Yeah. You did
I
see
did
that.
get to see that.
Okay.
And the prepping of Jeff the night before the direct exam.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was a
and
good
even
part of
when,
it.
even when he left, how they continued to talk.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I don't know what they did at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
They had meetings.
Or if Jeff had meetings, if it's all whatever.
I wasn't aware of them.
Did you? What kind of a vibe did you get from the daily newspaper reporters at the trial? Did you feel any sense of hostility or suspicion or aloofness?
Well,
or
the one from the AP said that she wanted to kick me in the balls. I guess.
Well, Naomi Kaufman?
Yeah, that seemed to suggest a feeling of hostility.
What brought that on? Just a generic dislike, or what?
No. She was writing her stuff, and everybody was always complaining about the daily newspaper coverage, And I made some remark to somebody, I don't know who it was, Bernie or Mike Mel or Jeff himself or somebody, that I don't know, she was half the time I said she wasn't even look to realize she was following the testimony. She was reading a paperback, or looking at a magazine or doing something. So somebody confronted her with that. She got all indignant. And she says, you shouldn't tell people. So I just said, listen, it's how you cover trial is your business. I said, but if I see you reading a newspaper, or a paperback book during the trial, in the course of a general conversation, I don't think I'm prohibited from mentioning that.
Yeah, right.
But I think that there were people. I know I read a couple of things written by people from North Carolina. Jeannie Carroll never really did, but that woman from Marilyn Mather from Charlotte wrote some kind of story about my role. That MacDonald had hired me to write a book about the case or something. Like he was paying me. I mean, there were all kinds of peculiar. There seemed to be a lot of peculiar vibrations, but I really wasn't. I was really focusing. I was working. I was really focusing on him. This was not a thing that was going to be repeated. This trial was only going to happen once, and I was learning. New facts every day.
You hadn't been exposed to this stuff
I didn't know
in any
anything.
depth before.
All I knew was that he told me the case was going to be laughed out of court. There was no evidence against him whatsoever.
Yeah.
That even the prosecutor. I remember Bernie said the night of the disco dance benefit, which is the one time I did meet Bernie in person. He came down to that thing, and we sat down for like 5 minutes.
Was that after you had met Jeff for the brunch or whatever?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it was a few days after that. Bernie came down, and we sat down and talked about the possibility of a book, and Bernie raised the question of money then, and I said, you have to talk to Sterling Lord about that. And I remember that night Bernie said, this case is, I don't want to make the trial seem like it's going to be that big, that dramatic a thing. He said, it's a farce that it ever came to trial. It'll be laughed out of court. He said, even the prosecutor is going around North Carolina saying that he doesn't think the chances of conviction are any better than 1 in 3. Which would have been Blackburn.
Yeah. Well, they weren't too optimistic, to be honest.
Which would have been what?
Blackburn was the prosecutor.
Oh.
And they weren't, even during the trial, even as I was learning all this stuff, which I was finding terribly disturbing, I said, my God,
You were like a juror,
I didn't know
essentially.
this.
You didn't, except that you got to see some of the stuff the jurors didn't get to see because of
a great deal. I got to see him a lot more than the jury.
Did you feel necessary to sort of keep a poker face, to keep both Jeffrey and the other reporters and so on from knowing what it was that you were feeling as you learned this stuff?
Well, I certainly wasn't going to go up to him at the end of every court day and say, Jesus, boy, if I was a juror, I'd vote to convict on what I heard today. But it wasn't that kind of an atmosphere. It was like the selling the president people never asked me, oh, by the way, do you like Nixon? They never said, well, what do you think? I mean, they were so, at least outwardly, so confident, so overwhelmingly overconfident, as it turns out, that the question of guilt or innocence, or that anybody could possibly have any question about innocence, it was just never raised. It was just not a subject that was ever discussed.
Okay.
The only thing that was ever discussed, I mean, they didn't discuss it among each other in my presence. They would only talk about, what an asshole this witness is, or how Bernie made mincemeat out of ivory, or how they really destroyed this, Oh boy. Will the judge dismiss it outright after the prosecution's case rested, you know.
Okay, sure.
And then they would grouse and bitch and moan about the judge's rulings. There'd be all this animosity toward Dupree for the various evidentiary rulings he was making, but there was never anything of, Joe, it's the first time you ever heard Shaw testify. Did you find him persuasive? You know, nobody was asking me questions like that.
Yeah. How about the Kassabs and the prosecutors? Did you have any relationship with them at all during the trial, or were they...
Zero. I knew...
You tried to avoid them, or they tried to avoid you, or what?
Well, I didn't try to approach them.
Yeah.
I knew that the time, if ever, to start talking to people like that would not be during a trial. First of all, the prosecutors weren't going to talk to somebody who was living with the defense.
Right.
And secondly, the Kassabs, you know, I would have to assume, in fact, I know this now to be a fact, but at the time I assumed they saw me walking in and out of the courtroom next to this guy who they've hated for 9 years.
Right.
They're not going to invite me over to their apartment for dinner, you know.
Yeah.
So I said this would not be a realistic time for me to even introduce myself to the
Did they ever
Kassabs.
say anything to you, or to snub you, or do anything out?
They never snubbed me because I never approached them. I mean, they knew who I was, I gathered later, but, you know, there was never any, you know, hostile glances. I just sat there, and at the time, you know, in court, I was just filling up notebook after notebook because I didn't have any idea whether or not I was going to have access to you know, complete transcript afterwards, or how much I would want. So I was writing everything down, you know, like I was the court reporter.
Yeah.
And in fact, the defense was not getting transcripts on a daily basis. In fact, they never got the complete transcript of the trial. In fact, it was only about 6 weeks ago that Ryan O'Neill, the new lawyer, called up here and asked Nancy if she could have me send Jeff's testimony at trial to him, because apparently he'd never read it.
Oh, really?
Or he didn't have a copy of it. I don't know why.
Do you have identified in your own head a moment in the trial, or a piece of evidence, or some St. Paul-like event that sort of knocked you off your horse and said, this guy did this thing, or
No, there really wasn't one thing. Like so many, like every juror who I talked to, they would pick out certain things as being more memorable than others, but every one of them said it was just the accumulation of everything.